The unwelcome guest. It had been a long week, one of those drawn-out stretches of time. It feels like the air itself is made of molasses. Lavra Denton, a quiet middle-aged woman with a love for peace, plants, and her aging Labrador, Toby, had just finished her third 12-hour shift at the local hospital. As a nurse, she had seen her share of chaos, but nothing prepared her for the madness that would unfold right on her own driveway. She pulled into her neighborhood, a picturesque HOA-governed subdivision named Willow Ridge, nestled in the outer skirts of a mid-sized American town. The homes were nearly identical, lined like disciplined soldiers along curved sidewalks, all manicured to perfection. The mailboxes matched, the fences were the exact height, and the grass had to be within a specific blade length, according to the HOA's seasonal grooming standards. Laura often joked that her neighborhood was so regulated, even the squirrels might need a permit to cross the street, but she didn't mind. She kept to herself, waved politely when needed, and mostly avoided getting tangled in the neighborhood's endless politics. That was until Karen moved in. Karen McBride was the newly elected HOA secretary, and a walking storm of designer sunglasses, clicky heels, and unsolicited authority. She had lived in the community for just under a year, but in that time had managed to write up more neighbors than the previous secretary had in 5 years combined. Whether it was mailbox paint that faded a shade too light, a trash bin pulled out 20 minutes too early, or a flag hanging at an incorrect angle, Karen had something to say, and worse, a clipboard to document it. But Lavra had managed to fly under the radar, mostly because she worked odd hours and wasn't home enough to get in Karen's way. That changed one Thursday afternoon. Laura arrived home, exhausted and craving nothing more than a hot bath and a quiet evening with Toby and a mug of sleepy-time tea. But as she turned onto her driveway, her heart dropped. Sitting in her garage or private, locked garage was a shiny new white BMW with vanity plates that read Chi RN1. Her garage door was open, wide open, and that BMW? It was idling, still running. As if daring her to ask questions, Lavra stared for a few moments, unsure if she was hallucinating from fatigue. She double-checked the house number. Yep, 23 Maple Hollow Lane. Her address. Her garage. Her home. Her space. But not her car. Her hands trembled slightly as she parked along the curb. She walked up the driveway slowly, her eyes narrowing. A few neighbors stood on their porches, some subtly watching through blinds, others pretending to water flower beds, as if the show unfolding wasn't the most interesting thing they had seen all month. Inside the garage, standing beside the BMW, in her spotless white pantsuit and holding an iced coffee, was none other than Karen. Her sunglasses were perched perfectly on her head, her phone tucked between her shoulder and ear as she barked orders into the air. She turned and smiled at Laura, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "Oh, hey, Laura. Hope you don't mind. I had a minor situation with parking enforcement. They were doing street sweepings today, and I didn't want to get a citation. You weren't home, so I just used the master HOA access key to get into your garage," she said nonchalantly, waving her hand like she was discussing the weather. Lavra blinked. Her voice caught in her throat, stuck somewhere between disbelief and fury. "You used the key to open my garage? And park inside?" Karen tilted her head with the kind of smirk only people truly detached from consequences could pull off. "Oh, sweetie, don't be dramatic. It's not like I broke in. It's community property. Technically, the HOA owns the land. We're all neighbors here, right?" Laura's jaw clenched, her breath shallow. She wanted to scream, to yell, to tell Karen to get out, but the words wouldn't come. Not yet. Her nursing training kicked in. Calm, controlled, measured. She said nothing. She simply turned and walked back into her house, closed the door, locked it, and leaned against the wood as Toby looked up at her with those wise old eyes. Her pulse thumped against her eardrums. She didn't say a word that night. Didn't call the police. Didn't knock on Karen's door. But something had broken inside her, something quiet but final. She made a cup of tea, but this time it wasn't to relax. It was to plan. The next morning she woke early, packed a bag, fed Toby, and walked to her garage. Karen's BMW was still parked inside. Typical. Lavra smiled tight-lipped and cold. She reached into the hallway drawer and pulled out the spare. Remote control to the garage door. Click. It rolled down smoothly with a low hum. Click. She locked the internal garage access door. From the house side. Click. The padlock she had installed a year ago when she noticed the HOA trying to install. A universal access receiver to all homes came into use. She secured it, double-checking everything. Then she got into her own car, parked on the street, and drove off. For the next 10 days, Laura did not return home. She left no notes, no explanations. Just her garage, locked tight, and Karen's BMW sealed inside. Like a trophy, she checked into a quiet cabin up in the Smoky Mountains. No cell reception, no internet, no HOA. Just her, Toby, and a stack of mystery novels she had been meaning to read for 3 years. Every morning she woke to the smell of pine and coffee, not HO complaints and exhaust fumes. Every night she slept deeply, wrapped in the satisfaction that somewhere, back in Willow Ridge, a storm was brewing, and she was not there to weather. It got back in the neighborhood. The drama exploded like gasoline on dry brush. Karen went door to door, demanding someone unlock the garage. She tried the HOA access system, but Laura's house had been secured against it. She called a locksmith, who refused to break into private residential property. She contacted the HOA president, who warned her not to overstep her bounds, especially given her lack of permission. When Karen called the police, the responding officer reviewed the complaint, raised an eyebrow, and asked her, point blank, "Did the homeowner give you permission to park in her garage?" "Well, I assumed it was implied," Karen sniffed. "No, that's not how trespassing works," the officer replied. As the days ticked by, Karen's carefully curated composure began to unravel. Her daily HOA patrol ceased. Her once daily Facebook posts about neighborly values and respecting shared community space were noticeably absent. She was no longer the queen of the cul-de-sac. She was the punchline of porch conversations, the whispered gossip of sidewalk chats. And Lavra? She hiked. She read. She laughed. She healed. Because sometimes the best response is not anger or confrontation, but quiet justice, timed perfectly and served with a smile. Karen's meltdown and the neighborhood wake-up call. It started with subtle cracks in the perfect facade. On the 3rd day of Laura's mysterious disappearance, when the locked garage door refused to yield, and Karen's BMW sat captive in what she now bitterly referred to as a suburban prison cell, the HOA secretary's carefully curated image began to implode. She was still trying to spin the storytelling neighbors. It was a simple misunderstanding, a temporary arrangement, a kind gesture that had been blown out of proportion. But no amount of cosmetic charm could distract from the cold fact that Karen had trespassed. And the neighborhood was starting to see through her act. What made things worse, far worse, was Karen's inability to admit fault. Rather than show humility or apologize, she doubled down. On day 4, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA board against Laura for unauthorized use of private locking devices that inhibit HOA emergency access. She claimed the locked garage posed a security threat to community safety protocols and requested that Lavra be issued a violation citation and fined $500 for non-compliance. But the board, already hesitant about her increasingly aggressive leadership style, pushed back. They cited no prior rules had been violated and reminded Karen that the only one who had used unauthorized access was her. Her complaint was not only rejected, but quietly filed for internal review. Whispers began to circulate that her role as secretary might be up for vote sooner than the term required. Meanwhile, back in the cabin tucked between towering firs and drifting clouds, Lavra sat on a rocking chair with Toby at her feet, slowly sipping hot chocolate. The silence was sacred. She had disconnected from everything. Her phone was off, her email untouched, her social media dormant. For the first time in years, she wasn't reacting to stress, she was breathing through it. Reclaiming space. She wasn't being petty. She was being still. She wasn't punishing Karen. She was drawing a line. A clear, powerful line that didn't need to be defended. It simply needed to exist. Her decision not to fight back publicly was intentional. She knew the power of silence. As a nurse, she had seen pain expressed in 1,000 ways, shouting, breaking, sobbing, but it was silence that often shook people the most. Silence forced people to sit with themselves. And that's exactly what Karen was now being forced to do in a garage-sized consequence of her own entitlement. By day 5, Karen was unraveling. The neighborhood Facebook group was abuzz. Memes began to circulate. One was a stock photo of a locked garage with the caption, HOA Justice, now serving BMWs. Another said, welcome to Willow Ridge, where your car can be rehomed for free if you act like a Karen. And though no one ever tagged her, she knew. Everyone knew. Karen was humiliated. She hired a private contractor to try to, legally, inspect Laura's garage, but was promptly warned by local law enforcement that any attempt to tamper with another resident's property, regardless of HOA status, would be considered trespassing and subject to arrest. That was the first time Karen had to swallow the word no since moving into the community. She stood on the sidewalk in her beige heels and pristine blouse, pacing in front of Laura's house with a clipboard in one hand and her phone glued to the other. She muttered angrily to herself, demanding someone take her side, someone validate her belief that she had the right to do what she did. But no one came. No one agreed. The silence from the neighbors was not apathy. It was the slow, collective turning of the tide. Many residents, once too afraid to confront Karen's tyranny, began sharing their own stories. An elderly veteran named Mr. Lyle, who had been cited for hanging a flag on a non-approved pole. A young mother fined for sidewalk chalk, defacing community walkways. A school teacher given a notice for letting her front garden grow a bit too wild. The stories were like tiny drops that turned into a flood. Suddenly, Laura's silent protest, the locked garage, the absence became a symbol. A quiet rebellion. At the next unofficial HOA gathering in the neighborhood park. Potluck arranged not by Karen, but by the neighbors themselves. Laura's name was spoken with reverence. No one knew where she went, but everyone agreed she had done something incredible. Not dramatic, not loud, just firm. And in doing so, she had sparked something. Back at the cabin, Laura had no idea of the cultural shift brewing back home. She was too busy savoring slow mornings. She journaled. She cooked real food. She hiked trails with Toby, his old legs still surprisingly strong. She meditated beside creeks. Her mind, once cluttered with fatigue and background noise, was becoming clearer by the hour. And in that clarity, she began to think not just about what had happened, but about what she wanted next. Because as much as she loved her home, the idea of going back, re-entering the exact same dynamic, the same passive routines, felt suffocating. She didn't want to live in fear of another intrusion. She didn't want to live in silence just to avoid making waves. Laura was realizing that drawing a boundary was only the first step. The next was speaking up. On day 7, Karen Nearly Manic filed a second complaint, this time accusing Laura of property abandonment. She claimed that prolonged absence with no response was irresponsible, and requested that the HOA place a lien on the property until ownership could be reassessed. It was a last-ditch, desperate move, and one that backfired spectacularly. The HOA board president, a man named Arthur Jameson, who had always been cordial to Laura, called an emergency meeting without Karen's knowledge. In that meeting, several board members agreed that Karen's actions were not only legally questionable, but socially toxic. A motion was introduced to vote for her removal from office based on abuse of power. And while the official vote would need to wait until quorum, the writing was already on the wall. When Laura returned on day 10, just as quietly as she had left, the entire neighborhood seemed to pause. She pulled into her driveway, parked her car, and looked at her home with fresh eyes. The garage door was still locked. The air felt different. She walked up the path slowly, not expecting anything, but not afraid of anything either. As she reached the door, a voice called out, "Laura!" It was Arthur Jameson. He crossed the lawn in long strides, a folder tucked under his arm. "We've been waiting for you," he said gently. "There's a lot you need to know." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Sounds serious." Arthur smiled. "It is, but also long overdue." That evening, Laura sat at her kitchen table as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. Toby lay by her feet, snoring softly. Arthur shared everything: Karen's escalating panic, the failed complaints, the neighborhood's support, and the vote that was set to take place next week. He told her about the Facebook memes, the sidewalk gossip, and the way her quiet act had changed something. For the first time in a very long while, Laura laughed. Not a small chuckle, but a full body-shaking laugh that made her eyes water. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't tired. She was awake. She stood, walked into the garage, removed the padlock, opened the door, and looked at the BMW. Still there. Still spotless. Still a symbol. She walked around it, opened the driver's door, and left a sticky note on the leather seat. It read, "Please return your vehicle. Hope you had a reflective 10 days. Oh." Then she closed the door, walked back inside, and started planning her garden, because spring was coming, and things were finally starting to bloom. A garden grows, and so does a movement. The next morning, a sound of birdsong mingled with the soft hiss of a hose as Laura knelt in her front yard, hands deep in rich soil, planting purple hyacinths and yellow tulips beside a row of foxgloves. She wore denim overalls and gardening gloves, caked with dirt, her face serene, her heart strangely light. It had been a long time since she had allowed herself to touch the earth with intention, to cultivate something living simply because it brought her peace. Toby lounged lazily nearby in a patch of morning sun, his tail flicking each time a breeze passed over the grass. The past 10 days had been more than a break. They had been a reclamation of self. But even as her hands worked among the roots and blooms, she could feel the tremble of something shifting in the foundation of her neighborhood. Something new was taking root alongside the flowers. By mid-morning, a small group had begun to gather at the edge of her property. At first it was just one neighbor, then 2, and within 20 minutes, a dozen residents had congregated on the sidewalk, some holding cups of coffee, others holding casserole dishes, muffins, and cuttings from their own gardens. They approached slowly, as though unsure of the protocol for honoring a quiet revolutionary. Laura wiped her hands on her overalls, smiling politely, and stood to greet them. It began with light pleasantries. Glad you're back. We missed you around here. How's Toby doing? But underneath each question was the unspoken truth. Everyone knew. They knew what Karen had done. They knew what Lavra had done in return. And more importantly, they knew what it all meant. Marjorie, an elderly widow who had lived in Willow Ridge for nearly 2 decades, stepped forward. Her voice was soft but unwavering. I just wanted to say thank you, dear. I've been afraid to speak up for so long. I didn't think anyone ever could. Her eyes shimmered. A young couple, Sam and Priya, joined in. We got fined last month for having solar lights that weren't community approved, Sam said. Karen said they made the neighborhood look cheap. We've been saving for months just to make our home feel like ours. And suddenly, we were criminals in our own yard. Another voice chimed in from the back. Miguel, a father of 3, who had once been written up for letting his kids draw chalk art on the driveway. We always thought we were alone. Laura's throat tightened, but she steadied herself. You're not, she said simply. Not anymore. That afternoon, a spontaneous idea began to take shape. It started with a single suggestion from Priya. We should start a community garden. Something real. Not the HOA mandated shrubs and topiaries. Something for us. Something beautiful and human. The idea spread like wildfire. Within hours, plans were being sketched on notepads, phone calls were made, and neighbors volunteered shovels, compost, fencing materials, and time. The empty lot at the end of the cul-de-sac, previously ignored due to HOA zoning, became the focal point of a new dream. Someone printed flyers. Another neighbor offered to build raised beds. Kids began painting signs that read, "Welcome to Willow Roots. A community grows here." But as the spirit of cooperation bloomed, so did the reaction from the woman who had tried to control it all. Karen had seen the crowd outside Laura's home. She had watched from behind her designer curtains as neighbors she once commanded now gathered without her. She saw their smiles, their energy, the way they leaned into Lavra like she was a lighthouse after a long storm. It was unbearable. The silent rejection cut deeper than any confrontation. She paced her pristine kitchen, muttering to herself. Pouring glass after glass of diet soda, she didn't drink, dialing the HOA hotline only to hang up before the first ring. The air inside her home felt tight, stifling. Rage clawed at her ribs, not because she had been embarrassed, but because she had been excluded. The next day, Karen did what Karen always did. She retaliated, this time with paperwork. She drafted a cease and desist letter addressed to Lavra, accusing her of inciting an unauthorized gathering, damaging HOA cohesion, and creating an environment of civil disobedience. She also claimed Lavra was now operating a community initiative without board approval, which, under bylaw 14.37, could be grounds for fines and sanctions. Karen hand-delivered the envelope herself, placing it on Laura's doormat like a poisoned gift. Laura received the letter the following morning, read it slowly at her kitchen table, and then quietly slid it into the recycling bin without a word. That same day, she submitted her own letter, this one to the full HOA board, requesting that the zoning guidelines for the vacant lot be reviewed in light of recent community support for shared spaces. Attached were over 60 signatures from neighborhood residents in support of the community garden. Karen's letter, on the other hand, was met with exasperated groans by the board. At the next official HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse. Attendance was at an all-time high. Normally, these meetings drew less than 10 people, mostly older retirees, and the occasional disgruntled homeowner. But tonight, the room was packed. People stood along walls. Children sat cross-legged near. Aback. The energy was electric. Karen, wearing a sharp navy blazer and holding her signature clipboard, took the floor with her usual confidence. We need to address the erosion of authority in this community. We cannot allow rogue efforts to dictate how our neighborhood evolves. Structure exists for a reason. The room was silent. Then Arthur Jameson stood. With respect, Karen, structure without empathy is just control, he said calmly. This community deserves joy, not fear. People want to live, not just comply. Another board member, a soft-spoken woman named Denise, added, and frankly, Karen, we've had more attendance, participation, and support for this garden idea than anything the HOA has ever proposed. Karen's face flushed crimson, her jaw tightening. So now we're just letting anyone do what they want? What's next, chickens in the yard? Wild paint colors? Anarchy? The crowd murmured. Someone chuckled. Laura, who had remained seated until now, stood slowly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. This isn't about paint colors. It's about community. I didn't ask for a revolution. I just wanted my home back. But it seems like others wanted the same thing. I'm not leading anything. I'm just not staying silent anymore. Applause rippled through the room. Karen stormed out minutes later, leaving behind a clipboard and an uncomfortable silence. That week, the board approved the first phase of the Willow Roots Community Garden. Karen's motion to fine Laura was unanimously dismissed. And something extraordinary began to happen. Neighbors who had never spoken before were now planting seeds together, not just in the soil, but in each other's hearts. Children laughed as they helped water the rows. Elderly residents shared stories and tips on tomato pruning. Lavra, once the quiet woman who kept to herself, became the unofficial guide of something bigger than herself. Not a leader, but a nurturer of the movement. She didn't chase authority. She earned trust. Toby wandered the garden freely, greeted. Like a local legend. People painted a bench in his name, Toby's watchpost. Even the air seemed lighter. Spring turned to early summer. The flowers Lavra planted in her front yard began to bloom with abandon. The garage, once a battleground, became nothing more than a reminder that peace doesn't always come through noise. It comes through clarity, through presence, through planting your feet in your values and refusing to be moved. Because sometimes the loudest power is the one that speaks softly and never has to raise its voice. The meeting that changed everything. The sun had begun its slow descent beyond the rooftops of Willow Ridge, painting the sky with warm hues of honey and coral, as if nature itself was honoring the transformation the community had quietly undergone. The garden at the end of the cul-de-sac had become more than a patch of earth. It had become sacred ground, a living symbol of what the neighborhood had always needed but never dared to create. A place without rules, without judgment, where people came not because they were told to, but because their hearts brought them there. And at the center of it all, not by choice, but by the simple force of her quiet courage, stood Laura Denton. She never called herself a leader, never asked for attention. But that is often how true influence begins, not in declarations or demands, but in quiet actions that resonate so deeply that others cannot help but follow. And yet, just when the community seemed to be finally breathing freely, the past threatened to pull the air right back out of their lungs. A letter arrived. Not from Karen this time, but from the HOA's legal counsel, delivered by certified mail and written with the kind of cold, perfunctory language that was meant to intimidate. It was addressed to Lavra and cited her for disruption of standard. HOA procedures, unauthorized use of common grounds, and involvement in the incitement of collective defiance. Attached were 3 pages of bylaws and clauses, each highlighted in garish yellow, and a notice of an emergency disciplinary hearing. Scheduled at the end of the week, Laura sat at her kitchen table, the document spread before her like a declaration of war. Outside, Toby paced the hallway, sensing her unease. She reread the letter, not in fear, but in disbelief. After everything, the peace, the healing, the community that had grown, this was their response? Word spread fast. By morning, nearly every household in Willow Ridge knew about the hearing. But unlike before, when such announcements would be met with either eye rolls or passive acceptance, this time the community responded with fire. A handwritten petition began at Marjorie's house and traveled door to door. By evening, it had collected over 100 signatures, nearly the entire neighborhood demanding the charges be dropped and the bylaws be re-examined for fairness and transparency. Arthur Jameson, the board president, was furious not at Lavra, but at how far Corinne's legacy had extended into policy, like rot buried deep in the wood. He held a closed-door meeting with the remaining board members, reading through the bylaws line by line. What they found was disturbing. Many of the provisions being used to target Laura had been inserted in previous years through backdoor votes and quiet manipulations, most authored or influenced by Corinne herself during her brief but powerful tenure. "We've been asleep," Arthur said grimly. "All of us. And now it's time to wake up." The day of the hearing arrived like a thundercloud, thick, heavy, electric. The clubhouse, usually echoing with the dull hum of bureaucracy, buzzed with life. Every chair was filled. People stood shoulder to shoulder, some holding signs of support. One read, "Laura stood for us. Now we stand for her." Another, "Rules without justice are just cages." Corinne was there too, seated stiffly at the front in a gray pantsuit, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face betrayed no emotion, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd like a general among traitors. Laura entered without fanfare. No lawyer, no entourage. Just her and Toby, whose calm presence turned more heads than any argument ever could. She sat at the front, her back straight, her eyes clear. Arthur called the meeting to order. "We are here to address a formal complaint filed against Miss Lavra Denton," he began, "regarding alleged violations of HOA procedures." However, he paused, looking over the room. "We are also here to address the very procedures themselves." Murmurs rippled through the audience. One by one, neighbors stood and spoke, not just in Laura's defense, but in support of change. Miguel talked about his children and the joy they found drawing in chalk, which had once been called graffiti by the board. Priya described the fear she felt when she received a fine for installing a rainwater barrel without prior approval. Marjorie recalled her late husband's grief when he was ordered to remove the wind chime she had given him because it was audible from the sidewalk. Each story was a crack in the wall, each truth a beam of light. And Lavra? She simply listened. She didn't argue, didn't justify. She let others speak. Because this wasn't just her battle anymore, it was everyone's. Finally, Arthur turned to Corinne. "Do you have anything to say?" he asked. Corinne stood slowly, her voice tight. "Order is necessary. Standards protect property value. Feelings don't change the law." Arthur replied without raising his voice. "No, they don't, but neither does fear. And we refuse to be ruled by it any longer." He turned to the crowd. "We have heard the community, and effective immediately, all charges against Ms. Denton are dropped. Furthermore, we are initiating a full review of the bylaws, and any provision passed under questionable circumstances will be frozen and placed under community vote." The room erupted into applause. Not the kind of applause reserved for celebrities or politicians, but the kind that bursts forth when a weight is finally lifted from the chest, a sound of collective relief, of regained agency. Corinne said nothing. She turned on her heel and walked out, her heels echoing down the hall, her clipboard, her weapon of choice, left behind on the table. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned a deep violet. Laura sat in her garden with a cup of chamomile tea. Toby lay at her feet. Flowers surrounded her, not just the ones she had planted, but those gifted by neighbors' sunflowers from Sam and Kriya, daisies from Miguel's kids, lavender from Marjorie's personal stash. The garage door was open now. Empty. The BMW had been taken 2 days earlier, returned without a word or a thank you, just a cold silence that Lavra had expected and no longer cared about. She had won something far more important than any argument. She had rediscovered her voice, and by doing so, helped others rediscover theirs. She looked out at the rows of newly sprouted lettuce and rosemary, the little signs painted by children, the wheelbarrow someone had donated with the words "Grow Together" etched into its side. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, and for a moment it felt like the garden itself was breathing. This wasn't just a victory for Lavra. This was the beginning of a new season for everyone. The vote that rewrote the neighborhood. The first true thunderstorm of summer rolled in like a sermon. Clouds built high and black against the twilight sky, and a wind swept through Willow Ridge, kicking up the scent of damp grass and turned soil. But inside the Denton home, it was warm. The lights were low. Classical music drifted from the living room, and Laura sat quietly at her dining table, flipping through a 3-ring binder filled with old HOA newsletters and bylaws that had accumulated over the years like dust on a forgotten shelf. Toby lay near her feet, breathing slowly, his head twitching as he chased something in a dream. She looked up from the pages as a sudden gust rattled the windows in thought, not with fear, but with clarity. Something bigger. His coming. It had been 3 weeks since the hearing, since the board dismissed the charges and promised a review of the bylaws that had shackled the community in silence. In that short time, everything had shifted. The community garden had tripled in size, thanks to donations from local businesses and the help of teenagers who once spent afternoons bored and screen-glued. A mural was painted on the wall of the old maintenance shed, a bright, joyous mess of color and life, with a banner that read, "Together we bloom." People who had lived next door to one another for years, without sharing more than a wave, now bartered tomatoes for cookies and hosted impromptu cookouts near the newly built picnic area. But alongside the progress grew tension, a shadow from the past that refused to vanish. Though Karen had largely disappeared from public view since the hearing, her presence lingered. Her allies, fewer in number now, were quietly gathering, whispering about losing control, dangerous precedents, and the erosion of standards. They didn't wear name tags or carry clipboards like she did, but their intent was the same. They wanted things to go back to how they were, predictable, ordered, fearful. And so, a special election was called. Under pressure from both sides of the growing divide, the HOA board agreed to hold a community-wide vote on whether or not outdated and manipulated bylaws should be repealed, rewritten, and replaced with a new charter that prioritized fairness, transparency, and communal consent. For the first time in the neighborhood's history, every homeowner would have a direct say in the rules that govern them. It was democracy in its most intimate form. Lara didn't ask to be part of the drafting committee. She didn't campaign. She didn't hand out flyers or post messages in the Facebook group. But still, her name was everywhere. To those who supported change, she had become a symbol of quiet resilience, of drawing a line and holding it even when it shook. To those who feared change, she was painted as the face of rebellion, the one who dared to lock her door when someone like Karen demanded it be open. Either way, she was unavoidable. As the vote approached, the energy in Willow Ridge shifted. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now gathered in cul-de-sacs at night, voices low but passionate. Younger families, once ignored at HOA meetings, began attending and asking pointed questions. Elderly residents wrote letters and placed them in mailboxes, recounting the ways rules had turned into punishments. It wasn't about Laura anymore. It was about all of them. But that didn't mean Karen had vanished. On the morning of the vote, Lavra woke to find a large envelope tucked into her front door handle, sealed in red wax with no return name. Inside was a printed letter, typed in sharp, serif font and signed only concerned neighbors. It was 5 pages of warnings about what would happen if the new charter passed, how property values would plummet, how chaos would follow, how people like her would ruin everything that made the community desirable. It ended with a final line in bold, "Sometimes rules protect us from ourselves." Lavra folded the letter neatly, placed it in her recycling bin, and made herself a cup of coffee. She didn't react. She didn't share it online. She didn't tell anyone. Not because she was afraid, but because she had learned long ago that some noise wasn't worth answering. That evening, the clubhouse was transformed. Ballot boxes lined the walls, manned by impartial volunteers. Rows of folding chairs were filled with neighbors, some nervously holding the new charter draft in their hands, others clutching the old HOA rule book like it was a Bible. There was no shouting, no chaos, just the heavy breath of a neighborhood standing on the edge of change. Each resident stepped forward in turn, showed ID, and cast their vote. One by one, no speeches, no drama, just quiet decisions made in silence. Laura stood near the back, speaking softly with Marjorie, who had brought her famous lemon squares to ease the tension. Miguel's kids played near the doors. Priya and Sam passed around bottles of water. It didn't feel like a political event. It felt like a family reunion. Then came the countdown. An hour passed, then another. People waited, sitting on the edges of their seats. Karen sat alone near the side wall, her lips pursed so tightly they turned pale. Finally, Arthur Jameson stood before the crowd, his face unreadable. "The vote has been counted and verified." He paused. "With 83% in favor, the new charter has passed." For a moment, no one moved. Then cheers erupted like a thunderclap. Children jumped up and down. Hands clapped. Hugs were exchanged. Someone wept. Karen rose to leave. Without a word, Laura didn't chase her, didn't gloat. Instead, she looked around at the neighbors she once barely knew, now hugging, smiling, sharing stories like old friends. She thought of how far they had come from locked garages and angry, letters to gardens and shared meals, and something settled inside her. A weight lifted. That night, as she walked home beneath the clear sky, stars blinking above like quiet witnesses, Laura passed the garden. It glowed faintly under the solar lights once deemed unacceptable. She stopped, knelt beside a patch of basil, and ran her hand over the leaves. Things had changed, and they would keep changing. Not because of one person, but because one person had refused to accept that nothing could dot, and in a neighborhood where silence used to rule, now something louder had taken its place. Hope. The day the locks turned and the voices rose, it was the 3rd Saturday of June, when Willow Ridge woke to the soft hum of lawnmowers, the clink of garden tools, and the slow murmur of families pouring out into sunlight. But it wasn't just a weekend. It was the first official Willow Ridge Community Day, unanimously agreed upon in the newly ratified charter, a day set aside not for rules, but for reconnection. The air held the scent of grilled peppers, fresh soil, and something deeper freedom. After years of silent frustration, anonymous citations, and fearful compliance, the neighborhood finally breathed as one. And if there was a face to that change, it wasn't the HOA president nor any board member. It was Laura Denton. Not because she asked for it, but because she had earned it without ever needing to raise her voice. From early morning, Lavra had been up tending to the garden, clipping rosemary, brushing away aphids, checking the rain barrel system Miguel had installed. A banner fluttered over the tool shed. Rooted together, a celebration of our community. Children had painted it, smudged with handprints and glitter, but it meant more than any official sign ever could. It was the first time in years. People from opposite ends of the neighborhood crossed each other's lawns without fear of being cited for foot traffic. Fold-out tables lined the parkways covered in baked goods, homemade lemonade, hand-carved woodcrafts, and a community. Bulletin board made of reclaimed fence panels. It was rustic. It was a little messy. It was perfect. Yet beneath the joy, a faint tension stirred. Because Karen had not spoken since the vote, she hadn't resigned. She hadn't challenged the result. She hadn't even shown her face at the clubhouse in the weeks since. Some said she had left town. Others whispered she was quietly organizing something behind closed doors. But Lavra knew better. Karen wasn't someone who walked away from control. She was someone who recalibrated, who waited so when a sleek black car pulled up just before noon, and Karen stepped out wearing designer sunglasses, heels that clicked. With authority and a clipboard tucked against her arm, a subtle hush spread across the crowd. She didn't speak right away, just walked straight toward the community garden with a composure so sharp it could cut glass. People moved out of her way, not in deference, but in surprise. Lavra stood her ground, wiping her hands on her jeans, her fingers still smelling of mint and thyme. She met Karen's gaze with calm eyes. Karen stopped 2 feet from her. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, though her voice had the bite of unspoken blame. "I just want to understand." Lavra tilted her head. "Understand what?" Karen looked around, at the people laughing, sharing, planting, living. Her eyes lingered on a boy, helping an elderly neighbor pot marigolds. "Why they all listen?" "To you," she finally said. Laura's smile was small, tired, but deeply kind. "Because I listen to them." Karen's jaw worked, the clipboard pressed tighter against her chest. This used to be a model community, controlled, precise. Look at it now. "I am," Lavra said. "And it's never looked more alive." Karen didn't respond. Her shoulders seemed to sag slightly, not with humility, but with the weight of being on the outside of something she never truly tried to understand. "You could be part of it," Lavra said, not as an invitation but a truth. But Karen just turned and walked away, back to the car that had no place in the rows of minivans and rusted sedans. The crowd didn't jeer. They didn't cheer. They simply went back to living, because they no longer needed to seek her approval. As the sun reached its peak, a group gathered around Lara to dedicate a new bench at the entrance of the garden. It was crafted from reclaimed wood, smoothed and varnished by hand, with an engraving across the backrest. Where one stood, many grew. A few clapped. Others simply sat, breathed, and remembered. That evening, the golden hour poured across the neighborhood like honey. Lavra walked along the sidewalk with Toby by her side, his leash dragging lazily, though he didn't need it anymore. Children played in driveways. Sprinklers flickered across lawns. Barbecue smoke drifted into the sky like a signal of peace. And on every porch, every corner, there were voices, not whispers of complaint, but conversations, laughter, music. She paused in front of the garage. That same garage where, months ago, a line had been drawn not with anger, but with clarity. It now bore no padlock, no scars. Just tools, a shelf of herbs drying in bunches, and a small wooden sign hung near the frame that read, "Boundaries grow gardens." The door was open, the air was warm, and the neighborhood had found its voice. The apology that was never spoken. It had been nearly a month since Karen walked away from the community celebration with her head held high, but her presence hollow. And in that time, something remarkable happened, not because she returned with a vengeance, nor because she tried to reclaim control, but because she did not return at all. The woman who had once patrolled the sidewalks like a self-appointed sheriff, issuing warnings and passive-aggressive citations, now existed only in rumor and speculation. Her house remained, her lawn maintained to perfection by a silent landscaping. Service, her windows shut, her blinds always drawn. People wondered if she was watching them through the slats, still tallying violations in her mind. But the truth was, Karen had become a ghost, not because she was forgotten, but because she had chosen silence in a world that had learned how to speak without her. Lavra never spoke ill of her. Not once, not when neighbors shared bitter memories. Or passive jokes, not when children imitated Karen's clipped tone with exaggerated sniffs, not when a few residents casually suggested they should just vote her out entirely. Lavra always responded with a soft shrug and returned to her garden, to her work, to her peace. Because she knew something deeper, some battles were better won by not swinging at all dot. And yet, closure has a way of finding people, not when they demand it, but when they no longer needed dot. It was a Thursday morning when Lavra heard the knock. Soft, measured. She opened the door, and there Karen stood, without sunglasses, without a clipboard, without the armor of superiority. She wore jeans, a plain t-shirt, no jewelry, no posture. She looked human, tired, smaller, not physically, but spiritually, as though the weight of years had finally settled on her shoulders. Lavra didn't speak. She stepped aside. Karen entered. Quietly, her eyes taking in the warm light, the scent of coffee, the bowl of fruit on the kitchen counter. "I came to get my car back," Karen said. The joke was weak, but it cracked the air like thunder. Lavra chuckled once, not unkindly. "Bit late for that?" Karen nodded. She moved to the table and sat down slowly, like she wasn't sure if her body was allowed to relax here. "I never apologized." "No, you didn't," Lavra replied, pouring a second cup of coffee without being asked. Karen stared at the steam rising from the mug. "I didn't know how." "I still don't." Lavra didn't rush her. She sat across from her, letting the silence fill in the gaps that didn't need words. "You weren't supposed to be the one to change things," Karen finally said. "You were quiet. You followed the rules. You kept your head down. You were predictable." Lavra met her gaze, calm and still. "Until I wasn't." Karen looked away. "I hated it at first. That you locked the door. That you didn't call me out. That you didn't fight the way I expected." Lavra said nothing. Karen added, "But now, I think I hated it because it made me look at myself, and I didn't like what I saw." The room remained still, the clock ticking in the background, the wind brushing against the house like a whisper. Karen sipped her coffee. "I thought controlling everything would keep me safe. That if everything stayed perfect, I'd never be left behind." Lavra nodded once. "Perfection isn't safety. It's fear wearing a nice jacket." Karen's laugh came quietly, then tears, not loud, not dramatic. Just a few slow drops sliding down her cheeks. Unacknowledged, Laura passed her a napkin. "Do you want to see the garden?" Karen looked up, eyes glassy. "I don't know if I deserve to." "That's not how gardens work," Lavra replied. "You plant, you water, you show up. Or you don't. It keeps growing either way." They walked outside together. The morning sun had begun to warm the earth. Bees buzzed lazily near the lavender. Marjorie was already trimming the zinnias. Miguel's kids chased butterflies between the squash rows. A new neighbor, a single father named Elijah, was painting a mural on the compost bin with his teenage daughter. No one stared. No one whispered. Karen wasn't met with stares or contempt. She was met with indifference, which, in many ways, was more humbling than anger. She wasn't the center anymore. She wasn't feared. She was just another neighbor. And for the first time, she realized how heavy the crown had been when no one asked her to wear it. Laura moved toward a shaded plot, a bare patch of soil waiting for something new. She handed Karen a small tray of seedlings, basil, thyme, and sweet marjoram. "I saved this spot," Laura said, "in case you ever wanted to plant something." Karen didn't answer. She just knelt, dug her fingers into the dirt, and began. They worked in silence, hands in soil, hearts exposed, and without a single word of forgiveness exchanged. Something more profound bloomed. Understanding. Later that afternoon, after Karen had gone home, Laura stood on her porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the neighborhood come alive. Children's laughter danced on the breeze. Neighbors swapped cookies for cucumbers. The new bulletin board listed free piano lessons, a carpool schedule, and a note about an upcoming movie night at the garden. The HOA still existed, but it no longer ruled. And the garage? Still open, still quiet, still a reminder that peace doesn't always come through compliance, but through courage, through patience, through knowing when to lock a door and when to open it again. The lock was never the ending. It was the beginning. It had been 5 months since the garage was locked, since the first line in the sand was drawn not with confrontation, but with quiet resolve. And as summer turned to fall, Willow Ridge shed its old skin with every crimson leaf that drifted to the earth. The community had transformed not into a utopia, but into something far more real. There were still disagreements. Lawns still grew uneven. Garden rows got messy. But something had fundamentally shifted in the way people moved, in the way they spoke to each other, in the way they looked one another in the eye. They were no longer afraid. The new HOA charter had taken full effect. The once powerful rules designed to stifle individuality in the name of uniformity had been stripped of their venom and rewritten with empathy. The role of the HOA had not been eliminated, but redefined. It was no longer a gatekeeper. It was now a guide, a support system, a shared voice rather than a loud one. And while the board still existed, it now answered to the people, not the other way around. Laura had not sought any position on that board, despite being urged by many. She politely declined every nomination. "I've already done what I needed to do," she would say, and returned to tending the rosemary or helping Miguel's youngest learn how to propagate succulents. She never wanted to be the hero. She only wanted to protect her space, her peace, and by doing that, she accidentally helped create a safer world for everyone around her. One crisp October afternoon, as golden sunlight spilled between amber trees, the neighborhood gathered for the first Willow Ridge Fall Festival, an idea that came from a brainstorming session held under a string of garden lights and powered by cinnamon donuts and late-night laughter. It wasn't HOA mandated. It wasn't voted on by a committee. It simply happened because people wanted it to happen. There were booths, wooden and handmade, decorated with colorful leaves. Local artists displayed crafts. Elderly couples sold jars of homemade jam. Children painted pumpkins in wild colors. Laughter danced through the air like wind chimes. The park, once silent and overregulated, was now bursting with music and scent and life. At the center of it all was the community garden, now fully matured and overflowing raised beds bursting with squash, kale, tomatoes, and herbs. Someone had brought a radio. Someone else had brought cider. And in the corner, under a makeshift canopy of draped sheets and string lights, a small acoustic band played softly, adding a soundtrack to this living story. Lavra stood quietly near the entrance of the garden, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. She didn't make speeches. She didn't gather attention. But people came to her, one by one, not to ask for anything, but to share. A neighbor who had just gotten a new job stopped to say thank you. A teenage girl gave her a handmade bracelet. A widower said that the garden had given him a reason to leave the house again. No one said the word hero, but that's how they looked at her, not because she fought, but because she stood firm without shouting. Even Karen came. She arrived slowly, almost uncertain, walking down the sidewalk with a basket in her arms. Inside were jars of pickled okra, tied with delicate red ribbon. She didn't draw attention to herself. She stopped at the booth table, set the basket down, and gave a quiet nod to the volunteer. Then she caught Laura's eye across the garden. For a moment, everything paused. Karen walked over. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. She looked different, not in appearance, but in energy. The sharpness was gone. Her shoulders no longer squared like a wall of defense. Laura smiled gently. I like your ribbons. Karen smirked faintly. They were on sale. You know how. I love a regulation discount. They both chuckled. No bitterness, no tension, just shared memory. I've been working on myself, Karen said quietly. Took some time off. Got help. I didn't know how angry I was at the world, at people, at myself. Laura nodded. Most people don't until someone locks the door. Karen looked down at her hands. I deserved worse. But that's not what you needed, Laura sighed. We don't heal by punishment. We heal by truth, by time. Karen's eyes shimmered with quiet tears, but she held them in place. Thank you for not fighting me, for not embarrassing me, for not becoming like me. I didn't want to win, Laura replied. I just wanted peace. They stood there, two women who had once represented opposite forces, order and rebellion, silence and control, fear and trust, and now they were just neighbors, just people. Karen reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver key. She placed it in Laura's hand. The master, HU whispered, I kept it. I don't want it anymore. Laura didn't look at it. She simply closed her fingers around it and slipped it into her coat as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting the entire festival in a soft orange glow. Someone lit the lanterns above the garden. Dozens of paper lights flickered to life, swinging gently in the wind. And beneath them, laughter continued. Music flowed. The scent of cinnamon and fresh soil carried on the breeze. Life, imperfect and real, bloomed with abandon. Laura wandered back to her porch as the evening cooled. Toby at her side, older now but still loyal. She looked back one last time at the garden, the people, the new willow ridge, and then she turned to her garage. The door was open not just literally, but symbolically. A reminder of everything that had been locked. And unlocked, she walked. Inside, took the silver key, placed it in a small box labeled Lessons, and shut it gently. Then she turned off the light. Somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter echoed into the night.